Yeah. I'll take care of that. Okay. Thank you.
Because
All
because
right,
some
let's
of
tell
us.
Shiur who's okay. So just to remind you, we're gonna just to remind you where we're up to. We've okay, right. Michelle says we're in a war. There's just nothing works. Okay. So where we're up to is as follows. We began the Mishnah, and just to remind you of the Mishnah says talks about a couple of things. The first thing it talks about is a little bigger for you. No, that's not working either. No, nothing's working. Let's try that. Okay, so the Mishnah says, right? So when you come from overseas and you bring a get, and we said the Mishnah starts in a weird place, it should have started at the end. But what are the reasons for a get? But we gave a couple of reasons why it might start from this place. Either way, the one witness who comes has to say b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. The continuation of the Mishnah talks about where you have to do it, and then it talks about the Gvulot of Eretz Yisrael. That's not our issue right now. What we've spent time doing until now is talking about two things. The first major topic we talked about was the issue of Edut, one witness. Is that something that perturbed the Gemara as well? The Gemara was interested in why one witness can come along and say b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. But before we even did that, we talked about Reish Lakish's din, about what's the issue of a get? Or how seriously do we take a get? After all, shouldn't we require witnesses? And we talked about Reish Lakish's din, which appears on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, which is once you have a written document, then it's commission nechkara edutan bebeitin. We talked about the Tosfot that says, so why doesn't every one witness just write down his testimony? We raised the possibility that maybe there's the way a shtar works is not exactly the same thing. This we did 2 times ago. Maybe the way the shtar works is not exactly the same way Edut works. Maybe it's a different track. Last time we talked about a little bit of the definition of a shtar. Does it require witnesses signing? Maybe there's some other way around it that you wouldn't require witnesses signing. Maybe you could just have one witness in some circumstances, stuff like that. All that being said, then last time we moved to our Gemara itself, and we talked about the my timer. So this is the first part of the Gemara, my timer, and we saw there was a basic machloket in the Gemara about what's the reason you require b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. Why one witness would be sufficient? Why not one would be sufficient? But why one witness has to say it, right? Rabbi Amar lefi she'ein b'kiin lishma, because the people, the people who you come to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel or from Zurich, as the case may be, right? You come to Eretz Yisrael, you bring the get. We're concerned that somehow Lishma is an issue, that the people who wrote the get weren't careful about the Lishma issue. And after all, it says v'chatav la Lishma. Right, one of the characteristics of the get, that's what we're going to explore today a little more, is that it has to be done Lishma. Talk about what that means in a couple of minutes. And once we would figure out whatever Lishma is, somehow the one witness coming along and saying b'fanei nechta can somehow overcome that problem of people overseas are not b'kiin Lishma. Rava Amar lefi she'ein edim mitzuin l'kaimo. Rava says a separate reason. This is all D'Rabbanan, right? It's not a D'Oraita din. It's a D'Rabbanan din. And the D'Rabbanan din is because now there aren't witnesses who can come along and validate the signatures. In other words, if we're in Eretz Yisrael, so I can just go from Ranana to Kfar Saba, go to the Beit Din and validate the signatures, and then the shtar will be fine. But, should someone come along apparently and question the get, so then we wouldn't be able to validate the signatures. But and then again, according to Rava, once one witness comes along and validates the signature, says that's enough to overcome the problem of says the Gemara, my beinayu. I lost a word here in my Gemara, but it doesn't make a difference. If 2 people come and bring it, right? Because if 2 people come and bring it, then you've overcome the problem of there aren't 2 witnesses to validate the signatures. On the other hand, you still haven't overcome the problem of, right? You wouldn't just say b'fanei nechta, but you still haven't overcome the problem of Lishma, and then the 2 witnesses would have to say, the 2 shlichim, so to speak, would have to say b'fanei nechta. Inami, alternatively, a second difference between the 2 Rav and Rabba would be Medina Lamdina of Eretz Yisrael. That's what I said, the Kfar Saba Ranana thing. There, again, we know that there's Lishma, but there wouldn't necessarily be, again, it's not Ranana the Kfar Saba, because that's not a Medina, but let's say from Eilat to Kiryat Shmona, so there we wouldn't have Eidim Mitzuyim L'Kaimo. The people in Kiryat Shmona don't necessarily know the witnesses in Eilat, but we know everybody in Eretz Yisrael is Biki and Lishma. Inami, alternatively, Ota Medina B'Dinat Hayam. If I bring it from Zurich to Geneva, so Zurich to Geneva, ostensibly people don't know Lishma, but they do know the witnesses, and therefore there wouldn't be a problem. Okay? Now the Gemara drills down a little, and it says, and this is where we got to last time, Ula Rabba, right? The way, by the way, I remembered when I was in 11th grade and I learned this the first time, the way I remembered who holds Lishma and who holds just to give you a way to remember it, right? Is Rabbas with a hey and Lishma is with a hey. They're both with mapikes actually, and that's a good way to remember it. Okay, that was just my mnemonic for remembering it in case you forget. So the Rabbi that I came up with in 11th grade. Okay, well the Rabbi the Fishen Bikin Lishma. Rabbi says Bikin Lishma libai trey. Shouldn't you require two witnesses? Whereas when he comes along and the witness comes along and he brings it from Zurich to Eretz Yisrael, and he shows up and he has and he says, why do we believe him? After all, you require two witnesses. So the Gemara answers, Eid Echad Ne'eman Be'isurin. When it comes to Isurin, one witness is believed. So that we talked about last time. Is this a din, right? Really, Eid Echad is Ne'eman as witnesses, or maybe it's just a Hanhaga, right? Maybe that was the distinction we brought up. I think 3 or 4 nafkaminas between the two approaches. When you would believe in Eid Echad, when you wouldn't believe in Echad. Says the Gemara. So that's what we did the last time. I'm putting that aside now. Says the Gemara. I know we didn't finish the topic, but we'll try to come back to it at some point. Okay. Says the Gemara. So shouldn't require 1 or 2 witnesses. The Gemara says no. It's like every place. And then the question is Ne'eman really Ne'emanut? Is this really like Edut? That in certain circumstances we believe 1 aid, or no? It's not Ne'emanut, but we have a Hanaga that we can trust 1 aid, right? You remember we talked about if we go to someone's house and you want to eat food, you don't have a checklist of I have to ask them. You just have basic requirements, and then you don't have to ask them anytime. You can trust them all the time. Says the Gemara, when do we say when do we say when we have a piece of meat in front of us, we don't know whether it's kosher meat or non-kosher meat? There's no reason to think it's kosher meat or non-kosher meat. So there's no chazaka. Our woman, who we know is married, right? She was in Zurich. We knew she was married, or at least the husband was married. She's still in Israel. We know she's married, right? She has a chazaka against her. Havi davar shebe'erva, right? So either the havi davar shebe'erva, that's one girsa, or havi davar shebe'erva, that's another girsa. Either way, it's a eid echad shouldn't be enough, right? Because in davar shebe'erva, eid echad shouldn't be enough. Vein davar shebe'erva pacham mishnayim. In other words, when it comes to testifying that someone's married, someone's not married, etc., you need 2 people. So the Gemara says, yeah, that's true, but rov b'ki in him. Okay, rov. We have a rov. Rov. Most people know how to write something lishma, according to Rabbi, who says that's a problem, and because most people know how to write, or if you're going to write a get already, you know how to write it lishma, and therefore we have a rov against that. The rov kind of cancels out the chazaka, right? Those two neutralize each other. Therefore, we don't have the issue of itchazik yisur anymore, and we can believe the one witness. That's ostensibly the discussion of the Gemara, and then the Gemara continues that we're going to do next time. Here, the question of when Rabbi says, I'm obsessed with the issue of Lishma, right? I'm totally concerned about it, and therefore I'm going to require an additional factor. It's not just the shtar that has to speak for itself, but I need 1 aid to say, b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. How do we understand this issue of Lishma? When the Gemara says, Lafisha ein b'kiin Lishma, is Rabbi concerned about Lishma per se? Or is he concerned that the get wasn't written properly? And he's just giving an example. Is Lishma an example? Right? In other words, is he obsessed with Lishma? Like I said, my mnemonic, Rabba Lishma. Or is Lishma just an example of things? Like, how do we know that it was written on the right cloth? Well, that I guess we could check. How do we know it was written with the right ink? That maybe we could check also chemically. Right? How do we know it was written with kosher edim? How do we know it was written with all sorts of things? Right? There's 10 different requirements the Rambam lists for what a get has to be done. So is Lishma an example of bad, that it wasn't written properly, or is Lishma a particular thing? So before we get to that, I want to talk about how, when he says b'fanei nechtam, how do we know that that's Lishma? Right? So Rashi here says, when the guy comes along and says, what you're going to call him Reuven. Reuven comes from Zurich. He brings the get to the woman. Before he walks to the Bezdin, and the Bezdin says, right, there it says, right, say it. Right? And then Reuven says, oh yeah, they told me to say b'fanei nechtam. So Rabbah says that overcomes the problem of Lishma. How? B'fanei nechtam means it was written in front of me, inside of me. How do we know that it was written properly? Says Rashi, Ein b'nei Medina Tayam b'nei Torah. Right? At this point in the Gemara thinks the b'nei Medina Tayam are not b'nei Torah. This is where the phrase b'nei Torah comes from, by the way. Ve'ein yodin shetzarich lichtov haget l'shem isha. We're going to come back to those words in a few minutes. They don't know that the get has to be written for a particular woman. Which they think, apparently, in Zurich, forget it, Ashkai, Martin, I'm going to stop using Zurich, because in Zurich, everybody knows this. But in Bavel, they don't realize that they think a get can be written as a tofes, right? Like a form letter. right? You can have a, what's it called, a boilerplate, right? They're not B'nai Torah. They don't know that you have to read it for a particular woman. You could just have a blanket form that you fill in the names. V'kraktiv, there's a pasuk that says,
So I thought you were using Zork because the Rabbanut doesn't recognize the Gittin.
V'kraktiv, v'katav la sefer kritur. It says you have to write for her. La, dahainu lishma, for her name. It has to be written particularly for her. That's what lishma means. It doesn't mean that a get is written for the purposes of a get. It means for this particular woman. Okay, so that's point number one. He says, or 2 points here. He says, number one, they don't know that it has to be written for a particular woman, and two, the same thing, and it has to be written for a particular woman. No, let me just give you an example, just so you understand. I'll give you some background, just in case, for those who are not familiar with this. When I fill out a ketubah at a wedding, I have a form that the Rabbanut gives me, right? And all I have to do is fill in the names, right? But the whole ketubah was not written, right? Again, the ketubah is not exactly the same thing, because that's a shtar mamon, it's not a shtar kiddush, it's not a shtar kinyan, but okay, whatever, you understand the point. When it comes to a get, when I take a couple down to a Beit Din to write a get, it takes, from the moment he finishes in the room with her, it takes about 45 minutes until the get comes back. Because we have sofrim who work in the Beit Din. There's specific sofrim who write the get on 12 lines and with all sorts of kavanot, etc. But the point is they have to write out the whole get from the beginning till the end. It's not like they have a form and they just fill in the names at the end. The entire get has to be written lishma, so that's why it takes a lot of time. So the whole in the least possible, in the least damaging way a get is done, it takes about an hour and 20 minutes. Because you have to do the Be'ur Shemot. That's what happens today. Usually they do it at 2 different times. But like if we were very efficient, we could do the Be'ur Shemot. They check out the woman's names and the man's names. Then they have the man instruct the sofer. The man actually purchases the cloth and the dio. Then he gives it to the sofer. He points to the shaliach, the sofer shaliach. Then the sofer has to spend about 35. I've seen it done in like 25, but that's the quickest I've ever seen it done. They write out the get. Then the dayanim read the get. The question of dayanim we'll get to, because it's not clear you need dayanim for a get. That's a question debated in the Noda B'Yehuda. But assuming you need dayanim for a get, the dayanim read the get, and then and only then does he give her the get. After doing all those things, so it takes some time. Okay, so that's what Rashi is referring to. A get has to be written for her. Hilkach. Okay, and how does b'fanei nechtav? So now, having established what our threshold is, how does b'fanei nechtav overcome that threshold? Hilkach omer shaliach b'fanei nechtav. He says it was written in front of me. I saw it signed. And then says Rashi. Here are the key words for Rashi. This is the Rishitas Rashi. I mentioned it last week, but now we're seeing it inside. This is how should underline your Gemaras. And then what do we do? He says, I said, oh, really? Very interesting. Tell us, was it written for this woman? And then he answers, yes, it was written for this woman. And later on, the Gemara explains my time Lishma. Why he didn't say no. So Rashi says basically the guy has to say it was written for her, but he doesn't say those words. He just says the 4 words. And then something else happens. There's an additional procedure that goes on in the Beit Din. Was it written Lishma? And he says yes. Okay, do you follow that? So Rashi requires really, really ideally, the words of Fanei Nechtam are not holy. They're not sacrosanct. The real important words are that it was written Lishma. Just they say Fanei Nechtam for some other extraneous reason. Okay? Now Rashi, latent in Rashi, is the assumption that what we're really after here, the threshold we're really trying to get to, is the Lishma issue. The Lishma is sui generis, that we're trying to just get to was it written Lishma or not all the other factors relating to a get. Somehow Lishma is important, right? Rashi even goes out to quote a pasuk, right? The main thing we need is Lishma. Tosfot doesn't, he demurs, he doesn't like this Rashi. Rashi, he quotes, Lishma is on the left-hand side of the sheet in front of you. What's mechubar? Mechubar, we'll see in the Gemara on Daf Gimel. Mechubar is that I'm not allowed to write. We're actually going to see it today before we get to the Gemara even. Mechubar means I'm not allowed to write a get on like a leaf that's attached to the tree, and then cut the leaf and then give her the get, because there has to be some sort of retzef. There has to be some sort of continuation between the writing and the giving. Okay, so Tosa says, "Hey Rashi, why are you so obsessed about Lishma? Why aren't we concerned?" Or really the Gemara, why aren't you concerned about other halachot? When he says b'fanei nechtam, shouldn't he testify to the fact that it wasn't written, in an inappropriate way? Meaning, again, he gives an example. It was written on a leaf and then you cut it off, and then it would be a problem, right? Could go mechuber or shina shmo ushma, right? whether he changed the names, right? In other words, he got the names right. Shouldn't he have to testify these were really their names? Right? We're going to see later on a rush that says he has to know their names. Right? Whereas the guy who comes has to actually know who they were and know they were married and stuff like that. Or nichta bayom. When he comes along and says B'fanei nechtam, Tosfos asks the question, why don't we have to, why is the threshold just Lishma? Why isn't the threshold that it wasn't written during the day? That it wasn't written at night, excuse me. It's not allowed to be written at night. Or it's allowed to be written in the day, but nechtam balay, it's not allowed to be signed at night. Right? Except in very, very rare occasions. I was once involved in a get that was done at night. Because it was an aguna situation and they broke the rules. It was very interesting. Ve'ein lomar de nakat lishma de shchiach tvei. Don't tell me that they chose Lishma just as an example. Though Tosfos has a havamina, it was an example because that's that's the thing that people most messed up with. The mishkachach get shmo kishma ushma kishma umishader v'gam hasofer. Sorry, the mishkachach get shmo kishma ushma kishma because the Gemara later on is going to give examples where there were two people with the same name in the city, right? And they give a get. So it does happen also. It's not any more uncommon than Lishma, says Tosfos. Again, that might be a weak argument. The Gam, and he has another example, HaSofer, Sheragil Lichtov Tov Se Gittin, Agav Shitvei Mishtale V'Katav Shmo Shma. V'odin L'Shar Lachot Gittin. Ze Eino. So Tosfos says, there's another example. He says, what if you're a get practice? You're learning how to write Gittin. So what do you think you do? You ever think about this? How do you learn to write a get if you're not allowed to write a Tofes? So he says, of course, you write a Tofes. You just ask them, what's your name? And then you write a thing. So you might have these Gittin, if you practice, you might have them hanging around. So why isn't that also a possibility? So Tosfos at least raising the Havamina, that's not the case. But Tosfos has a Havamina that really Lishma is just an example. That's what I'm interested in. Right? Says Tosfos, Umefarish Rabbeinu Tam, so Tosfos rejects this in the end. Right? The Kol Hilchot Gittin Bikin. The truth is that there's no reason to raise that threshold. It's not like the Lishma is different. Tosfos kind of gives a side answer. He says the truth is everybody in Bavel, Zurich, wherever you want to say it, knows all of Hilchot Gittin. Ella dahach drasha de v'katav la Lishma eino nir eit lehem ikar drasha. They know the 10 halachot of Gittin, but what don't they know? They don't believe in the rabbi's interpretation of v'katav la means Lishma. In other words, they know that a get has to be written in the day and signed in the day, and they know a get can't be written on Mechubar. They just don't believe the rabbi's interpretation that a get has to be written Lishma. Right? This is very fascinating. Anyways, I guess it makes sense. Like, psychologically, it makes sense. If all other shtarot we can have a tofes, so why not be done? We get to a get, you can't have a boilerplate. It's ridiculous. And plus, it takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money and it's a lot of resources. So he says the people in Chutz La'aretz just didn't buy this. By the way, I've seen modern exampple of this. I've seen rabbis who don't know Hilchos Gittin say, "Hey, can you send me a boilerplate for a get? I have to write a get." I've seen that happen. Right? So I saw it literally with my own eyes. I saw an intelligent rabbi who just didn't know the halachot. And he said, can you send me a boilerplate if I get? I have to write a get in my community. So I recommend him. That wasn't such a good idea. Right? So it doesn't seem like a basic halacha. What is ein bikin? It doesn't mean that they don't practice this. It's just ein choshishin l'drasha the lishma. They don't care about the drasha. Whereas basically it's not that they were ignorant, it's that they were arrogant. that's a good way to say it. Whereas they didn't accept the Chazal's drasha of the Katav Lishma. Okay, then he goes on to the continuation. Then he says, "V'had perush hakuntra." I'm skipping one line because that's the continuation where we haven't done yet. V'had perush hakuntra de memela shaylinan ihavi lishma v'amarin. He says, and when Rashi said that we asked the guy, "Is it lishma?" So Tosfos has agreed with Rashi on one point that it's an issue of lishma. He said, but he doesn't agree with Rashi on the next point. The next point is he asked the guy, "How do we know it's lishma?" In other words, having established that lishma is the criteria, how do we get to that threshold by b'fanei nechta? So Rashi said, "There's an additional procedure. You ask, and the guy answers." Right? Tosfos says no. Right? When Rashi says, I cannot find one place I never saw any place says Tosfos where you need to ask. And the difference between Rabba and Rava should have been, right? Rabba says the issue is Lishma. So the Gemara should have said, what's the difference? Whether you have to have this additional procedure or not. Rabba, right? The other one says, Rava. So you don't need to do an additional procedure. Just let him come and say, and then we know that there were Eidim there. So there's an additional procedure. That would have been a difference between Rabba and Rava. So Tosfos says, I don't like that. V'omeri, says Rashi. Says Tosfot, Stama Lishma Kamasid. Oh, this is interesting. Stama Lishma Kamasid. Okay, Tosfot says, Rashi says this on the next page. It means when you say b'fanei nechtav, we don't have to do any disciplinary procedure, because when you say b'fanei nechtav, we assume you meant the presumption is that they did it right. Right? We don't have to ask you an additional question. The presumption is you did it lishma. Okay, so there's two things in this Tosfot that are interesting for us. One, Tosfot says there isn't an additional procedure. Basically, when you come along and testify, when one person comes along and testifies, the presumption is that you did it lishma. And the second thing is that lishma stands out as a unique halacha because people didn't accept it, right? People didn't accept the drasha, right? All the other things were in play.
Shaliach from Chutz La'aretz does accept it.
Right, and the assumption would be, right, that the shaliach from Chutz La'aretz does accept the drasha, knows that it was done lishma. Or is that somehow he was able to convince them, or these particular dayanim knew in some way or another. Okay? So, but what's most interesting to me is the basic question, is Tosfos' Havamina. Tosfos' Havamina is that lishma is not just about lishma. It's about, in other words, one could have said, different than Tosfos, one could have said, lishma is not a case, it's an example of that it was all done well. And then when we don't have to ask him, because the presumption is when he comes along and says, he's basically saying the get was done properly, right? Mechubar, and all the other criteria of Gittin. That would be much easier to say, right? This doesn't give us a good, right? His reasoning is just I haven't found any evidence of that. But this debate, whether you say lishma is a case or lishma is an example, really cuts to the question of, is lishma different than all the other things? So it's how would we differentiate between lishma and all the other ones? In Tosfos' language, why would people not accept the katav la lishma, but they would accept everything else? Like, why would they do that? Why was lishma such an objection? I said before, sociological reason. But maybe there's something different about lishma that makes it much more worthy of requiring b'fanei nechtav, right? So that's what I'm interested in exploring right now. So when the Rav came to this sugya, he asked it in a kind of different way, a little different nuanced way, but I want to use his distinction and then try to show you a couple of nafkaminas and then maybe try to apply that also to the question. The Rav did not apply it to this place, but I want to apply it to this place as well. Okay? He asked, is the conceptual question, is lishma a detail in the ketivat haget? In other words, like Tosfos assumes, it's just like nichtav hayom and nichtav halayla, whereas we have 10 criteria, one is the lishma, whatever. Or is the lishma the beginning of the netinat haget? In other words, when you write something for this particular woman, for now I'm going to use that criteria. When you write it for this particular woman, and you write the get for this particular woman, you're actually already beginning not just the creation of a hefza, but you're actually engaging in the beginning of the netina. Right? You're not creating the implement, the tool, but you're actually beginning the process. Do you follow the distinction? It could be that nechtav hayom and nechtav balayla is a detail in creating the hefza shel get. Writing b'mechuber lakarka and then cutting and then giving it is a detail in the right. Anyways, if you write it on something mechuber lakarka, so you haven't created a hefza shel get. You haven't created an object called a get. You haven't created the implement that you can use. But lishma is not. It's possible that's another one of the ways to create a get. Or it's possible that writing lishma, and again, if you think about it intuitively, it makes sense. Right? What are you essentially doing when you write a get? In other words, when you write a get on mechuber, it doesn't make a difference whether you're writing it for you're practicing or you're really writing a real get. When you write lishma for this woman, you're not practicing anymore. You're actually engaged in the giving of the get. This is the first stage of the process. You follow? You follow that distinction? Is it creating the tool or is it engaging in the first step in the process? That's the distinction the Rav raised. Okay? So the first distinction the Rav raised, the first way the Rav saw this in the Gemara, this distinction played out in the Gemara, is actually in the Gemara itself. What does the Gemara do? You'll remember, if we go back to the Gemara for a minute, the Gemara said, how do we believe this guy? How do we believe the one guy to say, how do we believe him? After all, so the Gemara said, right? Remember that? We believe one witness. Then the Gemara said, that's when there's no chazkat isur, right? We shouldn't believe, right? The Gemara says, then once it's chazak isur, we shouldn't believe. And the Gemara says, says the Rav, I don't understand. Okay, you said it's itchazek isura. I get it, right? We're going to overcome the itchazek isura by the rov b'kiyim him. Why is the Gemara so obsessed with the secondary question of it's a davar shebe'erva? Why did the Gemara raise up this issue that it's a davar shebe'erva and davar shebe'erva pacham mishnayim? Why should the Gemara require two all of a sudden? Once we overcome the itchazek isura, the words having davar shebe'erva, vein davar shebe'erva pacham mishnayim, why don't we still say edach haneman b'isurin? Where it's why sometimes yes two and sometimes one. Said the Rav, oh, I'll tell you why. Because Rav said we have to think about when do we believe one aid b'isurin and when not. This comes back to what we said last week. Rav gave an example. He said, let's say you have a chalitza shoe. Okay? That's right. Would we believe one witness to say this is a chalitza shoe? What do you think? He said, ostensibly, yes. That's Eidach HaNe'eman B'Yisurin. It relates to Davar Shebe'erva. It relates to whether a woman can possibly get married. He said, yeah, but there, what's the aid doing? The aid is just telling us what this is, right? He's just being mevarer, right? When do we require two? When we need to create some sort of nuchala. When we're just testifying to what this is, then we say Eidach HaNe'eman B'Yisurin. So, correct. For Aiden to say chalitza we're done, we would require two. But to say this is a chalitza shoe, one aid would be enough. Whereas we have criteria where sometimes we believe one and sometimes we believe two. Mapitom the Gemara is bringing up when it comes to the issue of Lishma, it's davar shebe'erva and davar shebe'erva v'cham mishnayim. Apparently that doesn't relate, that is not like testifying this is a chalitza shoe. That's like testifying this is a get, right? We're on our way to a get. This is Gittin that's going on, right? We're in the process of divorce, right? So you see that so the Rav said in the Gemara, maybe the Gemara is exactly playing with that. When the Gemara raised Eidach HaNe'eman B'Yisurin, the Gemara thought Lishma, that's just a problem to get. That's just a detail, right? Is this a chefza shall get? That we were going to require one, just like this is a chalitza shoe. But the moment the Gemara realized that Lishma, according to Rabbi, the Lishma is not just, and again, this would uniquely be Lishma, right? This is not Lishma as an example of other things. This is uniquely Lishma. If it's unique, Lishma is a unique characteristic. This is already not the creation of a get, but the first step in the process of a get. Oh, that might require two. So the Rav saw that, he read that into the Gemara. Okay? He had another nafkamina, and then I'll try to apply it to our Gemara as well. Okay? There's a Tosfot later on. The Ri has a big chiddush. Very interesting chiddush. We talked about Mechuber a minute ago. Okay? Have you ever thought about the following situation? You know that a get has to be given willingly. Okay? It has to be given, but midah. We've talked about that. Okay? What if the person writes the get and then has a temporary bout of insanity? And then he gets better, and then he has the get in front of him and he wants to give the get. Okay? So, if all the criteria for writing the get are just to create the chefza shall get, right? They were to create, what would you say theoretically, if I ask you? Can you give a get like that? You wrote a get. You did it lishma. You did it not mechuber. You did it and all in the daytime. Can you give that get or not? Yes. So if you say that all the criteria, yeah. So what do you want to say, Michael? Go ahead.
Well, is it any different than if you write the get lishma, go to sleep, wake up,
excellent,
and then
Good
give
question.
it to her?
Excellent question. So sleep might be different because sleep in general is like not a criteria that. Sorry for the background noise. That's just the coffee machine. Okay. In general, I wouldn't allow that, but since my daughter is going to the army now, we're going to allow anything. Okay. So anything goes, Shiur. You can do whatever you want.
We can't even hear it.
Okay. So you're right. Sleep might be different, but it's the same example, Mike. So you understand the Rav's distinction. The Rav came along, right? The Ri comes along and says, again, I'm going to put sleep aside for a moment, just because sleep might be like a natural thing, right? But says the Ri, the reason there's a chiddush of the Ri. Omer Ri, that tzarich lizar shelo yitkalkel habal b'da'ato, the husband can't go crazy, then ktiva l'netina. If after he wrote the get, he went crazy for a few minutes, and then he woke up, then he, took his medicine and he got better, he can't give the get, says the Ri. Says the Rav, this is the Rav in the Shiur now, I just quoted him because I just thought it would be easier for you. Hiksha Marsha, the Marsha says, I don't understand. Says the Marsha, I don't understand. Why the heck would it be a problem? He was good when he wrote the get. He's good when he gives the get. Says the Rav, well, that's only if you see Lishma as a prat in the writing of the get, as the creation of the chefza, right? If Lishma is just the creation of the chefza, so you've created a chefza. The chefza is just sitting here on the side. You happen to go crazy for 15 minutes when you got better, so then you can continue giving the get. But if writing Lishma is not a creation of the chefza, it's the beginning of the process, then what have you done? You've basically cut the process in the middle and you become not good. You become pasul. Then you have to rewrite the whole get again. Follow? So the Rav said Lishma is not just a prat in the writing of the get. Lishma is actually the beginning of the process, right? Says the Rav Livrei Nunicha. Dim nitkalkal ben atayim nitbadel hatseruv ben aktiva lenatina. So here you have two nafkaminas, right? Why the Gemara brings up the end of Shabbat Pacham Mishnayim, why this is different than giving than testifying. This is the son. This is like testifying. This is a process of chalitza. That you need two witnesses for. You can't just have one person, right? The same thing. If you go crazy in the middle, you'd have to stop. Okay. So Lishma, before I continue, so Lishma might not just be a prat again. Lishma might be essential. If Lishma is essential, then when I put it back into our sugya, it could be that we take Lishma very seriously. It's not just Lishma as a prat again. When the guy says B'fanei nechtam, he's actually testifying that the get process began properly, right? And whether you take Rashi's explanation, you have to ask the guy, and the guy says yes, it was done Lishma. Or you take Tosfos that is Stama Lishma, right? You might be more inclined to Rashi, right? To say that you really need to know it was done Lishma, and we need to know it was done Lishma, right? But even if you take Tosfos that it was Stama Lishma, the bottom line is that Lishma is unique. It's very special, because if we don't have the guy coming along and saying this process was started properly, then it's very hard to move on, right? And this might also explain at least the Havamina of Tosfot. You remember the Tosfot last week? Tosfot says, I don't understand. In the end, how can we believe one person? Right? And Tosfot has to throw in the towel, do you remember, and say, yeah, we believe one person because the original get was created by two people. You remember? So the one person is just the continuation, so to speak. Right? Says, right? And then Reb Chaim said, no. Once you have a star, so the star has like its own life, and therefore we can go back to the original din. You don't really need two witnesses anymore. Right? That debate also might be relevant to this. If we're talking about the issue of Lishma, so we just need to know the process started halachically, Kemosh Tzarich. Once the process started halachically, Kemosh Tzarich, we just need a way to kind of push it forward, and then one witness might be enough. Okay? So those are a couple of nafkaminas. Rav Lichtenstein took this a step further. Okay? He said, we have to think about, when we talk about a get Lishma, and here we're coming back to Rashi's statement, right? Rashi above, where he said, Shetzarich lichtov a get l'shem isha. He said this whole thing might depend on which Lishma we're talking about. Because we have Lishma in different areas. And here I'm going to go a little off the page, but you'll see, right? In other words, there is a Mishnah that talks about Lishma. It's not like this is the only time in the Masechet that Lishma appears. It's true, it appears as the first sugya in Rabbah, but there's a whole Mishnah in the third parak that talks about different Lishmas. And then the Gemara raises all sorts of possibilities in different places about how Lishma works. So I want to look at Lishma for a moment in Gittin and in general. It says the Mishnah in Daf Kaf Dalet, Kol get shenichtav shelo l'shum isha pasul. Okay, if a get wasn't written for a particular woman, it's not a get. Okay? Or in the rough terminology, it doesn't begin the process of the Gittin going forward. Kate said, and I want you to think about the three different possibilities here and if there's a difference between them. Haya over bashuk, this should sound familiar because it's the same thing as kavana and mitzvot when we have like Megillah and stuff like that. V'shamak kol sofrim makrin ish ploni v'garish ish ploni makom ploni. Right, you walk by the sofer, the sofer office in the shuk, and you hear Reuven is divorcing Sarah in Nahardai. V'amar zeshmi v'zeshem ishti. He says, I'm Reuven. My wife is Sarah, and I want to divorce my wife, and I'm a Nahardai. Amazing. Pasula garishbo, because it was written for somebody else. Okay, that's case number one. Case two. Yeter miken. Katav legaret it ishto v'nimlach. Matzo beni ro v'amar lo shmi kishimcha v'shem ishti kishem ishtecha. Pasula garishbo. So I found, someone wrote a get to divorce, right? Reuven wrote a get to divorce Sarah. And then he said, I know you were Reuven and you were Sarah. I'm also Reuven and my wife is also Sarah. So can I use your get? That's also Pasul Garesh. Okay? So these are two cases. One is that he heard the sofer talking, but he didn't know who was writing. And he said, hey, that's my name, right? It's me. right? Is there a difference between these two cases in terms of Lishma? What do you think? And might that be relevant for us? Well, first of all, what's the difference between the two cases? Anybody?
Well, in one case it was used for.
I don't know if it was used for a gerushin. The first one, I don't know if it was used for a gerushin. I don't know if it was used for somebody else. In fact, I don't know if it was used at all. It might have just been a practice get with those names, right? The first case, I think Danny would formulate it like this. The first case is neutral. The second case is minus, right? The first case, it was written stam, and I want to take something that was written stam and apply it to my case. The second one was written for somebody else, but it wasn't used, and I want to use it for my case, right? So is there a difference between those two cases? So both of those qualify as low lishma. The question is how low lishma? Yeah, go ahead.
The second one seems like it was more Lishma.
It was written for somebody else, though.
But it was written for a get.
The first one was clearly written for. Are you saying the first one might have been written less because it was just written?
Yeah, because it was I don't know. Look, it was like a template or whatever.
It was a template.
It's more theoretical.
You happen to have used my name.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, right. Well, the second one was used Kilu in anger. It was used in for real.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, is that better or worse?
I feel like it's lishma, but not for l'shem shalah particular.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So here you get to a separate question, another question, a secondary, right? The first one we ask is a get the beginning of the process, or is a get just the creation of the chefza? When we talk about the creation of the chefza, we could also talk about two different dimensions of a get. We could talk about, is this get, what is a get supposed to do? A get is supposed to split, right? Lichrot. Right, it's supposed to divide between the two people. One might say the second get is a get kritut. The first get is not a get kritut. It's just a get that I want to apply to kritut. Right? You see that? Like when we talk about lishma, does the lishma have to be written to actually divide two people, or does it just have to be written as a general form? Right? Rav Lichtenstein saw this in a very, very, very interesting passage. There's a Gemara in Daf Kafdal that asks a different question, which you have to think about also. When it comes to a get, let's say I had a get, the first get, right? The get that was written stam, right? Get shekatva amar Rav Chizda, get shekatav shelo lishma. A get that was written shelo lishma. It wasn't written for this particular one. Okay? And then, ha'evir alav kulmus lishma. What'd you do? You took the quill and you wrote over it and said, okay, now it's all the name, it's all the words already. Right? It says Reuven and Sarah, but I just started off, right? B'motav tlata, I just wrote over the get on, with a secondary writing. So says the Rav Chizda, Banu lemachloket Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabban. That's going to be a debate of Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Titania, Haresh hayakatu tzarich lichtov et Hashem. You were trying to write God's name in a Sefer Torah. V'nitkaven lichtov Yehuda. And you didn't realize it said God, right? It said Vayomer Yehuda, right? So it says Vayomer Hashem, and you thought it said Vayomer Yehuda, so you started writing Yehuda. But
you got to the
you made a mistake, and you dropped off the Dalet. So you ended up getting to the place where you were supposed to get to. It's supposed to say Shem Hashem. You meant to write Yehuda, but you wrote Shem Hashem by accident, right? Because Shem Hashem is Yud Hey Vav Hey, right? So what do? Ma'avir alav kumus umekadsho. You can just. How would you say it again? How would you say Ma'alev Akumus, right?
Race.
No, not a race.
Trace.
Trace. Right, just trace it again. Umakadsho, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. V'chachamim omrim ein Hashem mino muvchar. That's not a good Shem Hashem. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Tilmalo. So that's the same machloket. The machloket by Sefer Torah, whether that's a good shame or not, right? The Chachamim would say that's not a good shame. Would say also you can't use a get like this, right? Rav Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda who says that it is a good Sefer Torah, it's a good Shem Hashem when you wrote a Ktav al Gabe Ktav. So also you could write a get like this, right? It's the next line that's more interesting to me. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov Dilmalohi. Maybe it's not the same. Maybe Sefer Torah and Gittin are not the same. Adkan lo kama Rabbanan hatam debiinan zeili van veu veleka aval hachalo. Says Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and that's where the Gemara ends in our version of the Gemara. No, maybe the Rabbanan who say it's not a good when you write in Hashem is because Sefer Torah that needs to be beautiful. Really, they believe Ktav al Gabe Ktav is Ktav, and you can do it all the time, and you can create a Chefza by Ktav al Gabe Ktav. By the way, for those who think this doesn't happen, one of my close friends, I was the witness at his wedding, and they signed the Ketubah, and we did the whole wedding. And after the Ketubah, Rav Shechter called me over, and he said, "We have a little problem. Can you come to the side room?" And they forgot, in America, they forget to finish they don't threaten Vikanina, and they forgot the Kuf. And he said, we have to write the start, we have to sign it again. So I said, there's a beautiful Ketubah, it costs hundreds of dollars. How are we going to do it? So Rav Shechter said, no problem. Do Ktav al Gabe Ktav. That's what we did. So in this person's thing, I'm not even sure he knows. On his wedding,
Wait, just the whole thing?
5 years ago, my signature appears once, but doubled. Okay? I remember, I'd never been called into a room by Rav Shechter before. It wasn't the most comfortable. Like I said, did I screw up? He said, no, they screwed up. Okay. So anyway, so really this answer is Ktav al Gabe Ktav is good all the time. It's just in Sefer Torah we're going to require when you have Shem Hashem, you have to say Van Veu. That's God's name. Make it beautiful, right? We have a nice etrog, we have a nice lulav, we have a nice Sefer Torah. You don't want to do Ktav al Gabe Ktav for a side reason. Okay, that's the Gemara's answer. However, in the manuscripts of the Gemara, there's another answer. This wasn't my discovery. Rav Lichtenstein discovered this already. It's in the Ritva as well. The Ritva says, continues the Gemara, even though it doesn't appear in our versions of the Gemara, where it says, Va'ad kan lo machshir Rav Yehuda hatam. Oh, and Rav Yehuda, who says that in Sefer Torah, you can do it. Right? Remember we said in Get, it's the same model as Sefer Torah. Listen to this line. This is a critical line. This is like basic. In Sefer Torah, there you don't have to do it. Why not? Ela bishum, the lo ba'inan, there's a typo here. The lo ba'inan kritut. He says in Sefer Torah, there he'll allow Ktav al Gabe Ktav because you don't require. I don't know why it's not fixing it, but it's not fixing it. Kritut. Whereas Ktav al Gabe Ktav can work in a Sefer Torah. I don't need it to look beautiful. I need it to. I'm fine with it. Ktav al Gabe Ktav is Ktav. In Get, you need something more. What do you need? This is dramatic. This is as drama as you get. A Get can't be done Ktav al Gabe. Sefer Torah you can do Ktav al Gabe Ktav. Get you can't do Ktav al Gabe Ktav. Why not? Because a Get, when it's written the first time, requires it has to break up the couple. Right? And if you do Ktav al Gabe Ktav, the Get itself didn't do that. Right? Do you see that? Danny, do you see? You look like you're a little perplexed. In this version of the Gemara, right, you can't do Ktav al Gabe Ktav in a Get because the first document didn't co-rate.
The first document didn't succeed.
Right. What does that show you? What's that an indicator of? Exactly what we've been arguing. That at least in some versions of a Get, when it's not written for the shame of the woman, when it's not written Lishma, it doesn't engage in kritut. It's not just another detail. If it was another detail, so Ktav al Gabe Ktav should work. But if Lishma is unique, it's sui generis. Lishma is the beginning of the process of the Get, of the giving. It's part of the process. Then hey, if you screwed up that process, you can't retract, right? You can't go back and try to start it again. You got to start from the beginning. You understand? You can't just use the Get. If it was just a detail in the Get, then I don't see any reason why you couldn't do Ktav al Gabe Ktav. So the Rav's thing could also fit into here. And finally, we'll stop here. One final thing, which might be an afkamina between these approaches, if it's part of the process or not. We said that b'fanei nechtav, again, the threshold. Let me just make it clear. B'fanei nechtav is going to be a much higher threshold the moment you think that the ktiva lishma is lishma, and that's like a process of the Get, right? So maybe this is my suggestion. Maybe this other machloket might also be relevant to this discussion. Okay. When one second. I'm going to typo here. Yeah. When the guy writes the Get, or the sofer writes the Get, what does he have to do to make it lishma? I know it has to be for these women, for this particular woman. But does he have to do like a Sefer Torah? Does he have to say, I'm writing it lishma? You have to say those words. Right? So look on the left-hand side. Here there's a debate. The Tur says, when it comes to Sefer Torah, this is a Sefer Torah. All of us have participated in writing Sefer Torahs, right? And they always say L'Shem Kedushat Sefer Torah, right? Umaspeak l'kol hasefer im lo umaspeak l'kol hasefer im lo asakin pasul. If you didn't do it right, you have to say at the beginning, and if you didn't do it, it's pasul. So he has to actually articulate it in the Sefer Torah. But later on, the Torah says, "Afal pi shamar b'tchila k'tiv Sefer Torah shekatol l'shem kedushat Sefer Torah v'chol pam shekotev shem tzarich." Every time he writes Shem Hashem, tzarich lachshov shekotev l'shem kedushat Hashem. He has to think. So why is it that the whole Sefer Torah you have to articulate it? When it comes to the Shemot of Hashem, you just have to think it, right? It's a little strange, don't you think? What about in Gittin? So here, I just brought one text, the Sefer HaTruma. He says, when it comes to the Hilchot Sefer Torah, when he sends it to the tanner, he has to say, I'm doing it for Davar Kedusha. You have to say it. You have to say it, not just like you have to think it. Or he disagrees with the Torah of the Sefer HaTruma. Very interesting. He has to say to the Eidim, L'shem ha'isha legarsha u'lahatira. Okay, so that's a separate issue. The Rav has an article about that as well. But he says here, when it comes to, I made it smaller, sorry. When it comes to get, you have to actually say it. Why would you have to say it to the, right? No, when it comes to Sefer Torah.
He has to say it in front of the Eidim?
Yes, he has to say, I'm doing it for this woman and this man. That's a strange requirement. And I'm contrasting it to Sefer Torah.
What is he doing in front of the Eidim?
He's saying, I'm letting you know that I am writing this get for this man and this woman. Okay. Reuven and Sarah who live in Nardai, and this is who they are exactly.
I missed something. Sorry, at the beginning. He writes the full thing in front of the Eidim.
Yes, he doesn't have to write it in front of the Eidim, but he has to tell the Eidim before he starts writing, I'm doing it for these people. And he has to articulate it. The Eidim have to see that.
But the Eidim have to be present at the beginning of the writing.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Unlike a Sefer Torah, where he has to say it, well, he has to say it to himself at the beginning. When it comes to the Ktivat Hashem, the Shemot Hashem, he doesn't have to, he can just think it. Why should it be different? So Reb Chaim has this difference between the Shemot Hashem and whatever. I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time. But the very fact that he has to articulate it in front of the Eidim and say it, right? I'm doing it for this man and this woman. Unlike, he doesn't have to say, I want you to know that I'm writing this get during the daytime and b'mechubar, right? You understand? In other words, he doesn't have to do all those details. It's somehow like the Lishma factor is not the same as all the other get. It's not a detail in the process it's not a detail in the creation of the chefza. It's part of the process of the netina. It's part of the process of the get. So again, I've given you 4 examples now. Again, I think I made a more compelling case than I thought myself when I prepared this. So again, there's 4 examples of this distinction that the Rav put on the table, right? Again, the Gemara says that you have to. Rabbi says, right? Lefishan and Bekin Lishma. The Rishonim asked the question: is Lishma just an example, or is Lishma unique? Is much sui generis? Does it certainly raise the Avami? That raised the possibility that Lishma actually might be unique in terms of the Pratei Gittin. The Rav raised that as a question: is it part of the details of a get? Is it part of the creation of a get, like Mechubar Bayom, or is it unique because it's the beginning of the Netina? Right? We saw 4 examples of where this might manifest itself. First of all, after Eid Echad and Rabbi Yisur, and you remember the case of the Rav's example about testifying this is a Chalitza shoe. Certain things you require too. The Netina, right? The giving of the get you require too. And maybe that's why the Gemara thought even after we overcome the problem of Itchazik Yisur, you still might require to. Secondly, the issue of whether if you're sane when you write the get, but then you're not sane in the middle, and then you give the get, maybe Lishma would be unique. That seems to indicate that Lishma is a part of the giving of the get. The third part was we raised the possibility very quickly, right? The Rav Lichtenstein's thing that the Gemara raises that maybe a Lishma is a din in Kritut. If the get wasn't written Lishma, according to this alternative reading of the Gemara, if the get wasn't written Lishma, then it's not a din of Kritut, and you can't do Ktav al Gabei Ktav. Why wouldn't you be able to do Ktav al Gabei Ktav according to that version of the Gemara? Ostensibly because this isn't just the creation of a get. If it's the creation of the get, why not Ktav al Gabei Ktav? That works in every other place. It works in Sefer Torah. Right, but maybe it doesn't work because you need something more. You need the beginning of Kritut. Writing of the get is the beginning of the Kritut. When we're writing Lishma, at least, is the beginning of Kritut. And finally, whether you need to articulate it or not. So all these come into raising the question of Lishma. Okay, so that takes us through Rabbah. We've discussed Rabbah and the issue of Lishma. Next time, Ritz Hashem, either we'll move on to Rava. I think we'll move on to Rava in the Kaimo. To do that, we're probably going to have to take a bigger step, again, one bigger step out of this thing, and talk about Edim Masir Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Lezer, Edim Masir Karti, Edim Chatima Karti. We're gonna have to go back a little to that, but I have to decide which direction I want to take it, whether to deal with that later on Daf Daled or to deal with it already now. That I'm still dealing with. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you very much. Have a good, safe week.
Thank you.
Ema's outside.